Hey, movie fans. Now back here with Rachel McDonald. On this video, we're going to do another top 10 list, another decade top 10 list, and that is Rachel's favourite, the 1980s. So, movie 1980. And if you haven't already guessed, I am ribbing her, of course. But this was Rachel's idea, which was partly what makes it so fun. Famously isn't a fan of 1980s cinema, so that makes her list very interesting. For me, I am a big fan of the decade in film, especially with certain genre movies, I would say. But some good like cult movies or like art house style movies as well. So I think my list probably will be quite reflective of some of that and some of the variation of the decade, I hope. Now, I think at a later date or sometime we'll definitely do like a debate on 80s versus 90s, because it is one of the things we keep coming back to. Is at the end of my list, I will run off some honourable mentions. And if my honourable mentions don't convince you, then it's a good decade in film. I don't know what will, really. I've got a shit ton of really good honourable mentions.
All right, we'll see. We'll see how we go.
But just before we start, was the fact that you're not a big fan of the decade, did that make the list easier or harder to come up with?
Yeah, so it made it harder. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this decade is because I actually wanted to challenge myself to see if I actually could find 10 films from this decade that I loved enough to put in a top 10. So a few of them were quite easy. And when you look at my list, so I was born like right in the middle of the 80s. So I kind of missed the 80s and grew up in the 90s. And that's maybe why I prefer the 90s so much more. But a lot of the films I watched from the 80s would have been kids' films because I would have watched them as I was a young child in the early 90s. So that will be reflected in this list. So yes, this was a little bit of a hard list for me. I don't really have any honorable mentions because these 10 films really are the 10, like for me, the cream of the 80s. And I mean, to be fair, and to kind of like explain away, to be fair, I haven't seen that much of 80s movies. Like, because I grew up in the 90s, that was my decade. So if I were to sit down and look at movies that I've watched over my life, the majority would probably come from the 90s. But that being said, because I was born right in the middle of the 80s, I did get the tail end of the 80s. So I did see quite a few from there as well. But yeah, this was a hard list to do, to try and find movies that I love enough from that decade to put on this list. And I do think that this is going to be maybe one of the lists where I think there's only one, maybe two crossovers that I think we're going to have. And so I think the rest will be a very varied list. So yeah, this is kind of exciting to see how this list goes down. Number 10, I'm going to kick off with a very 80s classic, a movie that a lot of people really do love from the 80s, and for a very good reason. I've gone for a John Hughes classic from the year I was born, 1985, and that is The Breakfast Club. So The Breakfast Club is such a staple teen 80s movie. You know, when you think of John Hughes movies, it's usually the first one you think of. I didn't see this until I was a bit older. I actually only saw it for the first time in my 20s. And I was struck by how relevant it still felt. You know, the 5 teens in a Saturday detention. That's something that obviously you can still relate to now because detention still very much exists, you know. And I love all the different archetypes of the 5 different students and the way, you know, they break them down over the day. It's a wonderfully acted film. You know, the cast is really fun. It's very 80s. Molly Ringwald, Amelia Estevez, Judd Nelson, you know, and I think that each of the characters are really fun characters in their own rights. I think everyone has a lot of fun with the characters that they're playing. Obviously, it being an 80s teen film and it being a John Hughes film, there are aspects that haven't aged fantastically well, but I think for the teen films of this time, this is one of the ones that has like the least problematic aspects of it. There's actually no sexual assault or anything like that that's played for laughs. And I think that the kids in this film, the actors brought a real authenticity to this film. It feels very genuine. I know that there were whole scenes that were like ad-libbed by the actors. Hughes just gave them free reign, and a lot of the emotional scenes, I think, go really deep. I really like that. Again, these are issues that a lot of kids today can still relate to. Peer pressure, parental pressure, you know, not fitting into certain groups, feeling like an outcast, feeling like, you know, an imposter, feeling like you're never going to be good enough. And I really like films that have characters that wouldn't normally connect under circumstances, you know, that are extraordinary, and then finding that they have things in common, that they maybe are very similar. So I think it's just one of those really fun, sweet little coming of age films that has kind of stood the test of time. And I think when you look at like greatest movies from the 80s, you'll almost always have, you know, The Breakfast Club in there. And it is one of those films that I can still just kind of throw on a Sunday afternoon and watch. It's funny, it's fun, and it's got some really fun lines. It's got some really fun dynamics. And you would think that the premise wouldn't work so well, you know, one day, 5 students just stuck in school, but it works so well. And it's parodied so many times. Like, I always think of it when I watch Dawson's Creek and you see that season 1 episode when they are all stuck in the library. You know, that's obviously a parallel. Riverdale did a similar kind of episode. And yeah, just a really fun movie. So that's kicking off my top 10, The Breakfast Club.
Okay, nice. That's a good start, and yeah, that's a movie I like as well. I think it does hold up pretty well. There's 1 or 2 scenes, like you said, that, like any movie that's now, like, what is it, 35 years old, something like that around it. You're always gonna have stuff, and it's probably a little bit overrated, but in general, I think it's a very good movie. The cast are really well cast, good set of characters, and some really fun, iconic scenes. Yeah. Great use of music, which is something John Hughes films always had. Mm-hmm. And I know people debate whether it's like really that true to life or the teen experiences, and you can go back and forth. I've certainly heard people say it is and people say it isn't, but it certainly is representative of a certain kind of experience. And broadly speaking, I think there is something quite true to life and relatable about this idea, the way you do stumble into unlikely friendships with people you wouldn't expect to like hang around with otherwise, and a darker movie than people give it credit. It is.
Yes, when you listen to the kids, some of their confessions are like, wow, like these kids are not in good like home situations. And yeah, I think it does get a bit darker and a little bit deeper than when you first watch it, than you initially realize.
The Reputation. And is another staple of 80s, I would say, but this time in the horror genre. Although it's a sequel, it's one of my favourite sequels, probably.
I think I know.
Yeah, you probably know, and it's a toss-up between this and the original movie. But I'm going to go with A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 3.
The Dream Warriors.
Yeah, air guitars at the ready for that glorious rock and roll song and soundtrack. So this was a real surprise, really. It is one of the best horror sequels probably ever. It does exactly what you need to do with a horror sequel from such a beloved, iconic original movie, because the second movie was this weird sort of thing which didn't have that much connection. It did feel like a standalone sequel, whereas the third one actually connects back to the original movie. And they do everything they need to do for a sequel, where it plays tribute and it feels like a nightmare film, but it also builds on the mythology and the characters and the world. And they flip it around where suddenly Freddy isn't really the main star attraction anymore. Like in many ways it is about the kids, and it's about the kids turning the tables on him. It was a great way to reintroduce Nancy into the universe, and it's a perfect twist having her being like a dream psychologist, and having her then sort of get to know these kids and encourage them to work together to go after Freddy. It also does a great job of bringing John Saxon back, and his role is very meaty and significant. And it's just a lot of fun. It's got a great soundtrack. It's got the Welcome to Primetime Bitch line, which I've quoted before, which is absolutely wonderful. Love that death, love that line. So Freddy's on good form. There's stakes, there's tension, there's some good kills. Like the original movie, you've got some fun practical effects that are really effective and hold up over time. And it's a very emotional ride of the film, you know, like the ending of the film, the way they end it, which I won't spoil, obviously, in case you haven't seen it. But if you haven't, they do a great job. There's some great set pieces. You've got Freddy at his best once again. It definitely is a toss-up whether you like this or you like the original more. They're both excellent movies. I think I've gone with this for now just because it impresses me how good it is as a sequel. And it's really up there with the first film. Like, it really builds on the first film nicely. And it's so rare that you have a sequel which is A, that's satisfying, and B, you can say, yeah, it's right up there with the original movie. Like, a lot of times it's much harder to do a good sequel than it is to do a good first film, because it's got the pressure from that original movie. You do the Nightmare movies one day on the channel.
We will, absolutely.
Without doubt. One of the major horror franchises. But for now, my number 10 is A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors.
Excellent. That's a great pick. I mean, I'm with you. It really is one of the best horror sequels of all time. I did contemplate it because I do love Dream Warriors. It's just, like you said, it's just so good at bringing back the original feel. Bringing back Nancy is fantastic. I love the new kids. Greatest theme song ever. Those guitars are working overtime and it's fantastic. And yeah, just a really, really fun. So many iconic images in that one, from the Freddy worm. I mean, that Freddy worm is insane and so much fun. And there are some great deaths. I love the kid who has his veins used as like puppet strings. That was one of the most horrific images, I think, in a Nightmare film. Just so horrifying. And yeah, I love the way it all kind of came together, and like you said, the way it pushes the teens to the forefront, and we actually really get to delve into like these teens characters. And I think that Patricia Arquette, it's Patricia? Yes, it's Patricia Arquette in this one, isn't it? Yes. I think she's very good as Kristen, you know, kind of the new final girl. So that's a great choice. I love that to kick off your top 10. That's great. All right, so at my number 9 is a movie that we have actually reviewed on this channel that we both love and that we both very much agree is a Christmas movie. It is the 1988 Die Hard. So, of course, I had to have Die Hard on this list because, I mean, one of the greatest action movies ever and just such a fun film. And when we rewatched it at Christmas last year, I just remembered how much fun this film is. You know, we talked about how action movies these days have become very serious, you know, very intense. It's all, someone's kidnapped my daughter and I have to go and save her, and everyone's very and grim and realistic, whereas Die Hard is just fun. You know, it's just a really fun movie. John McClane just running around Nakatomi Towers trying to keep, you know, a lid on things. You've got the late, great Alan Rickman as Hans Gruber, who's obviously one of the best movie villains of all time, just hamming it up with his terrible German accent, but at least his American accent is slightly better. So that at least evens the scales out. And of course, I love McClane's the way his little bond with Roy, you know, who's on the ground talking to him in Nakatomi. Obviously, it's filmed really well. You have some fantastic action sequences. And as we talked about, you get some real, like, intense moments with McClane where you can feel the danger he's in and you can feel the hurt he's going through. The glass scene, you know, the bare feet on glass scene is obviously a particularly, like, intense one. And, you know, you've got all the iconic lines. Welcome to the party, pal. You know, yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker, all of that. Argyle is one of the greatest characters ever. He's just chilling in his limo. He's got no idea what's going on. He's having a good night until all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. I mean, we covered most of it in our review, and people, you should go and watch that because we had a lot of fun doing that review because we both had so much fun rewatching that movie. But of course, yeah, this has to be on the list. The only reason it's so far down is because the ones that are above it are more films that I've been watching for lots of years and have rewatched many, many times. Whereas Die Hard, I haven't rewatched that often, but I'm pretty sure that from now on I will be pulling it out around Christmas time. So it might move up the list as we go. But yes, that's my number 9, Die Hard.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to reveal if it's on my list or not. It is definitely a contender to be on the list, and that's all I'll say. As you said, we did do a review, so a pretty full-on review. You can find that on the channel. I'll probably put that in the top of this video or something. But yeah, absolutely is a classic. Absolutely is a Christmas movie. And there's actually a link to your number 10 if you want to. Do you know what that is? Link between Die Hard and The Breakfast Club.
No, tell me.
Okay. Well, it's the guy who plays the douchey cop in Die Hard is the guy, the principal.
He's the principal. Yeah. Yes, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah. You're completely right. He is. Oh, that's cool. That is actually very cool. I didn't realize.
Slimy actor. Yeah, Paul.
Yes, he plays those types of
characters
as well.
Is. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, Number 9. It's a movie I'm sure you've heard of. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but my number 9 is Do the Right Thing.
Oh, heard of it? Haven't seen it.
I've seen it, yeah. Yeah, I think it's one you would probably want to check out, considering some of the themes. But it's a Spike Lee film, and it's the Spike Lee film which became his calling card, one of his big early movies, and it's still held up as one of his best movies ever, and really the film which defines what Spike Lee is all about. And the late 80s, sort of into the early 90s, there was definitely a movement of more diversity in Hollywood filmmakers. John Singleton's another example of that, but of just, more African-American influence on films, a bit more on the independent scene, but making a little bit of a splash. And Spike Lee, obviously, a big part of that, Over One Day, and it's set on this particularly hot day in New York, so the heat is a big device in the story when it comes to how it ramps up the tension amongst the characters. And it's all set around this pizzeria where you have these two different cultures who sort of converge onto the pizzeria, and you get a big dispute which is in danger of spilling out over into violence, and is looking at, racial tensions around New York amongst these different groups. And also you've got the guy who runs the pizzeria, Danny, played by Danny Aiello, he's sort of caught in the middle of it, and he's one of those characters where at times he can come across as a little bit of a bigot, but at times he also comes across as quite human and fair-minded at times, and sometimes it's just that he's caught in the middle and he's just trying to do his job and things. But that's the setup for the movie, so it's got a nice little clear-cut device, and it's very well shot, it's very well directed. As I said, the psychology of it is very well done. But it's also not really a conventional movie, as it's not like a conventional thriller or a conventional drama, because Spike Lee, I think, does like to throw in other touches, other things from other genres, where at times it's quite, I don't want to say hammy, but it does, I think, because of the nature of this thing bubbling along and all these tensions, it does play out in quite an over the top way at times. But I think one of the things he does really well is then just to get the message out there and to make it really vivid and accessible, is he is a very direct filmmaker. And that's not to say there's not intelligence to what he's doing, but I think he definitely likes to just put these things on screen in a very direct way that confronts the viewer, and he does that very well in this movie. It's one of the best examples of him doing that. There's a lot of tension, but again, there's lots of grey areas between the characters where there's no clear-cut bad guys or good guys. It's definitely very critical on the policing when it comes to these things at times, and some of the racism issues with that. But as I said, it's like the pizzeria owner played by Danny Aiello. He's a very sympathetic character at times, and his loyalties are split down the middle, and occasionally, as I said, he comes off as a bit of a douche, but then there's other times you have sympathy with him. So even though it's quite a direct, in-your-face film, also it's not black and white. It's not all clear-cut, neither, with the characters. So it's a very engaging, a very intense, dramatic film with some great uses of music and some wonderful like cast of characters and actors, because it feels like a very, even though I said it was heightened, it does feel like a very authentic movie, and he does a great job of putting you on that street on that particular day and making you feel like, yeah, this is a real situation, and and he just puts you in it. It's like a very immersive sort of style of filmmaking. So I've seen quite a few of his movies, and some I really like. There's some that I don't like, but this holds the test of time. Clear-cut example of what Spike Lee does when it comes to tackling like racism and some of his politics and some of his ideas. This is definitely a good starting point, I think. So that's Do the Right Thing.
Oh, you know, like I said, I have heard of it, but I haven't seen it. But like listening to you talk about it, and I just had a quick look, and it looks like it's got a really good cast as well.
Yeah.
It does sound like a movie that I would, definitely like, because I do love those types of movies that kind of delve into, you know, those sorts of themes of, you know, racial discrimination and what it's like to live in a multicultural or mixed neighborhood, how different tensions arise between different groups. And I do think sometimes that films that are only set, you know, in one day, they can be really powerful depending on how well they're done. So I think I'll definitely have to check that one out and see how we go. But no, that's definitely put that on the to watch list.
Good stuff.
Alrighty. So coming in at number 8, not so much a crossover, but kind of in the same realm as one of your picks in the same universe. I have gone for the original movie just because it is so good and I love it so much, and that is A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. So I do love Dream Warriors, and I'm with you as far as sequels goes, but I think the original wins out for me just because it is the first, and it's so, you know, when I first saw like the Freddy films, I just remember the concept of Freddy scared the daylights out of me, you know, just this idea that this guy comes after you in your sleep, because the bottom line is at some point in time you have to sleep. You can't get around that, you know. This is not a monster that you can keep outrunning. So I think A Nightmare on Elm Street, such a great film. I mean, Wes Craven, he's so good. Robert Englund, and this is obviously Freddy before he became like wisecracking Freddy. This is like truly terrifying, like silent Freddy. I mean, he does have some great lines. The "This is God" line we've talked about before, you know, that one's fantastic. I always love that shot of him with the elongated arms, because that is just terrifying. And you know, the dream sequences as well are really good. I particularly love Nancy's dream sequence in the school with the body bag and her friend waving at, like Tina waving at her through the body bag, is a particularly creepy one. Nancy is a great final girl. You know, Heather Langenkamp is so good and so charismatic, and I think that she just works really well. Definitely one of my favorite final girls, Nancy Thompson. And I think that the movie just has a really great pace, you know, it moves really well. You get really sucked into like this world. You feel the teens and their terror and their tension rise. I love that Nancy is so proactive. I love that she buys that book, which is like home booby traps and like safety guide, and that's how she like traps Freddy. It's almost like a Home Alone thing. Obviously you've got and you mentioned the actor, but I've forgotten his name, the one who plays her dad. He is fantastic. That's the one. Yes, he is so good. And of course, you know, the supporting characters are really great too. You've got a very young Johnny Depp in his like first ever role. And I do kind of like, they do a little bit of a bait and switch with A Nightmare on Elm Street, because you start off thinking that Tina might be our main character, you know, because we open with her dream and we open kind of on her, and then we get that bait and switch where it becomes Nancy. And, you know, I think anyone who's seen A Nightmare on Elm Street just knows how iconic it is. And I mean, it spawned so many sequels. Freddy went on to become such an iconic horror movie villain, and it all just starts right here. We've obviously got some great deaths. You know, Johnny Depp's death in particular is always well remembered, but I also think Tina's death is fantastic and so terrifying. The way she moves around the room like she's being pulled on invisible strings. I think that's fantastic. And yeah, like I said, I just love so many of the dream sequences. And it's just, I think 80s horror has this really kind of like gritty, almost dirty feel to it. And I kind of like that because I think it really works for A Nightmare on Elm Street and just showing how nasty Freddy can be. And of course, when you find out his backstory, when you find out what the adults did to him, when you find out how useless the adults actually are, this all kind of feeds into everything. I think the only part of the film that I don't love is the ending, and I think that is fairly common for most horror fans. And as we all know, this was not the original ending, and Wes was quite disappointed in what they ended up doing with the end of that film. So I need to find, I know that there are alternate endings out there, and I need to find them and have a watch, because I'm assuming that the original ending was much stronger than the one that we get. But I mean, The Nightmare on Elm Street, it is a classic for a reason. I'm pretty sure it was on both of our like top 30 horror films. It's just such a great film, so much fun. And like I said, I do love Dream Warriors, but I think this one wins for me just because it is the original, and I just love the beginning of everything and seeing everything fresh and from the start. So that's my number 8, A Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to argue with any of that. I don't really need to add anything, really. And the standard of the deaths are so good in it as well. Like each one. That could be another thing it has over Dream Warriors. I think overall the deaths are probably a bit better.
I think so, yeah.
But I just, Dream Warriors, I maybe like for a different reason. Like, because there's nothing wrong with the deaths, and there's some very good ones, but I think overall the deaths are better in the original movie. But it's
definitely a franchise we will review at some point, because it'll be a lot of fun to go through that one.
My number 8, David Cronenberg, one of my favourite directors, and really 70s and 80s was the peak for Cronenberg, and his very disturbing, very satirical, fleshy body horror style, which became like a subgenre of its own. When you hear like the term body horror, it sort of comes from Cronenberg originally. Yeah,
absolutely.
And I've gone with Videodrome, probably one of his best loved films, at least from this era. So just to sum up the plot in case you don't know, because it is a little bit of a cult movie, but you got James Woods as this sleazy like network executive, so perfect casting right there.
Yep.
And he gets hold of this unique sort of like almost like snuff film, which is called like Videodrome, which he's obviously considering putting on his network to try and pull in the viewers. And along the way he gets more and more drawn into the mystery behind where exactly this broadcast comes from, because it seems to come from like a foreign sort of outlet and something which is very offline. There's talk of it being very political in its existence. So it becomes almost like a detective style story at times, with him like tracking down the source, looking more into this. Along the way, he meets Debbie Harry of Blondie, who, of course, one of her very early film roles, she's involved in it, and they kind of have a relationship. But what it's basically about is about him becoming more and more drawn into the world of Videodrome, and more like the psychological impact on him. But it's one of those movies where you're never quite sure how much of it is real and how much of it is in his head. So it's kind of playing on virtual reality, but it's also a very early example of what we now see on the internet with certain videos, with certain broadcasters. And it's a very political movie. Like it's really ahead of its times when you consider it is like really drawing a link to certain countries and their politics now, and how they get those politics across to a very niche but very kind of passionate and hyper like audience. So it has a lot of very interesting ideas, very powerful ideas about like consumerism, about politics, about fringe factions. Again, I think if you just move it forward 2 or 3 decades, you can definitely apply it to like social media nowadays. And it's a very entertaining film. It's a very pulpy film, but I think Cronenberg uses that sort of genre to make you think about these bigger themes. That's one of the things that he does the best. Woods is very good. I think he's very rarely been better. He's so well cast in this. He's just got the manic sort of facial expressions that you want. Debbie Harry's very good. She's really well cast. You've got a bunch of other characters in there. But it's very entertaining to watch. It's very distinct and stylistic. You've got like certain iconic images, like the video cassette going into his chest, certain like erotic style images, and just a lot of like psychology and a lot of playing with the mind, what's real, what's not real. And a very, very interesting ending to the movie, which you can read one or two ways. Like, Cronenberg is very good at not giving you clear-cut answers, like making the viewer think about this stuff. So I think this film holds up very well. Once again, you've got a good example of 80s practical effects, some good music, some good themes as well. You've got a great iconic like line as well, "Long live the new flesh," which I'm a big Cronenberg fan. I like a lot of his movies, and there's other movies from this decade of his which definitely could be on this list or could have been on the list. The Brood is another very good one from this decade.
Oh, The Brood.
His remake of The Fly is very good. So
Yes.
he was having a very good run in the 80s, some of his best work. And this is a cult classic, I think. It's a very powerful film, but also a very entertaining film. Very scary at times when you think about some of the themes. As I said, virtual reality, I think it's poking at stuff like that. It's poking at like consumerism with certain products. I think like when he goes into the glasses stores and you've got all these different glasses on the shelf, fun, fleshy cult movie. I was lucky enough to see a screening of it at a cinema when I was in London a few years back, so it was very great to see on the big screen. Very unsettling movie. Videodrome by David Cronenberg.
I only found out about that movie a few years ago through watching History of Horror with Eli Roth's History of Horror. And yeah, it was just, I haven't seen the whole movie, but the bits I saw, and I went and tried to find it online as well. And it was just, I think it says a lot about hedonism as well. And also about, like you talked about how it's kind of a precursor to the internet. I think it's also talking a bit about like kind of pornography as well, and the way in how if you indulge in too much pornography, then you have to keep going looking for things that are more extreme, that are more, you know, messed up to get your kicks off. And I think that this movie really shows that, because, you know, they've got that scene like where, you know, Debbie Harry sits down to watch it. And she's like, no, leave it on. It's actually kind of interesting, but you can see how they're getting, you know, sucked into this, this really bizarre, like videotape. And yeah, some of the imagery in that movie is just like, wow. Like you said, Cronenberg and body horror are like pretty much synonymous. So one day I will sit down and watch the entire thing and get a really good idea of it. But yeah, from what I did see and from what I did manage to find, it's very intense, bizarre movie. But I agree with you. I think James Wood for that character, just like perfect. He's so good. He's like slimy and sleazy and so good. And yeah, Debbie Harry, from what I saw, seemed really good as well. So I will have to sit down and watch it in its entirety. But I was, when I was watching History of Horror and I came across that, I was like, wow, there is some messed up stuff in the 80s, and especially from Cronenberg. So The Brood is another one we'll have to review as well, because The Brood is insane. Cronenberg's mind is just crazy, but no, that's very, very cool. All right, so we're going into, I mentioned that quite a few of these on my list were going to be childhood faves, so I'm going into the childhood favorite area with my number 7, which was a movie as a child that gave me nightmares for months. It's a sequel to a very well-known movie, came out years after the original movie, and that is Return to Oz from 1985.
Okay.
So Return to Oz is obviously the sequel to The Wizard of Oz. I think, 50 years after the original was made. And this one actually sticks closer to the books than the original movie. And I think that's just because it was made later and therefore they were able to do a little bit more. The original studio, they basically wanted to make Oz look big and colorful and pretty, but Oz is actually like a really messed up land. So in this one, Dorothy, just a brief run down for anyone who hasn't seen. Dorothy in this one is actually the right age that she's supposed to be, so she's 12 or 13. She's played by a very young Fairuza Balk in one of her earliest roles. And this is Dorothy after she's come back from Oz. She's actually in a mental asylum, and they're about to give her electric shock therapy to make her forget Oz when there's another natural disaster. She gets swept away and she ends up back in Oz, which is not the same Oz that she remembers. It's basically become desolate and broken down. All of her friends are missing, the ruby slippers are missing, and it's basically about her journeying through Oz to find out what happened and get her friends back. It is also complete and utter nightmare fuel. This is a movie that could honestly be a horror movie because the things in this movie, not cool. First of all, you have the wheelies, which anyone who doesn't know what those are, go and look them up on YouTube and enjoy your nightmares. Those things were terrifying. They're basically four-limbed humanoids who scream and wheel after you at like fantastic speeds, and they were all played by contortionists, so they look really unnerving. You have a princess who has various heads, likes to take her head off and replace it with another head, and of course she wants Dorothy's head, so that was pure nightmare fuel. And then the big bad is the Gnome King, who is like this claymation monstrosity that haunted my dreams for years. But despite all of this, this is actually a really fun film. Fairuza Balk is really watchable as young Dorothy. She gets a new sidekick called Clock something, TikTok or something. I can't remember his name, but he's like a mechanical toy, and she has a talking hen. So when I was younger and we had chickens, I was always trying to get them to talk to me, but never worked. So, you know, maybe I just don't have the gift like Dorothy. But it's actually a really fun film. It's a really fun sequel. And like I said, I've read the Oz books, and this is much closer to Oz than the original film is. I mean, the original film definitely has moments of horror, and the Wicked Witch of the West still scares the pants off me because she is terrifying. But mostly, I think the original movie is still very much a kid's film, very much family friendly, and doesn't really portray Oz the way it should be portrayed. Whereas Return to Oz really lets loose with everything, and it is just pure nightmare fuel. I have loved it since I was a kid. Even with all the nightmare fuel, I really think that this may have been one of the reasons that I grew up to love horror so much, is because I watched this movie so much as a child. We had it taped off TV on VHS, and it was just a lot of fun. And if anyone who does love The Wizard of Oz and hasn't seen Return to Oz, I would highly recommend watching it, because you will get a better sense of what Oz is supposed to be like and just that world in general. So that's my number 7, kicking off my childhood faves, Return to Oz.
Okay, so that's the first one of yours that I haven't seen. I've never seen Return to Oz, so it's one I definitely want to check out. Like the original Wizard of Oz, I've seen quite a few times, and I do like a lot. But yeah, I've always heard the sequel is a very different kind of movie, and yeah, I'm excited to check it out, and probably at some point we'll do it on
that would be cool
on the show, and probably do the original as well.
Yeah.
80s was quite a good decade for like sort of, I think, like family kids films being darker, like being more scary.
Definitely.
I think of something like Never Ending Story in that category.
Yeah,
that's actually quite disturbing for what it is. And also Labyrinth. There's some creepy scenes in Labyrinth as well.
I was thinking Labyrinth, definitely.
Yeah.
There was, and well, I mentioned recently that I watched In Search of Darkness, which is about 80s horror films, and they actually have a whole section where they talk about how kids' films of the 80s were like little mini horror films. So I do think definitely for that decade. You also had, I think The Witches came out in the late 80s, and that was
and that's quite a dark film.
That was terrifying as well. Yeah. So yeah, we definitely got more kids' horror on screen in the 80s, I think.
Number 7 is a debut film, and I think it's one of the best debut films that I've seen. So it's the debut film by the Coen Brothers, and it is Blood Simple.
Okay, I know of the Coen Brothers, but I don't think I've heard of this film, so that's interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because we haven't really talked about the Coens, so I wasn't really sure how much of their stuff you'd seen, and we'd not really chatted. But so this was their first film. And it's a very tense thriller, it's set in a Western setting, so it has a very neo-noir style feel to it at times. Very haunting use of music, like their regular composer, Carter Berman, does an excellent score.
Mhm.
But it's just one of those films where less is definitely more. Like there's a lot of like sense of wonder to it, a lot of sense of like things not happening or suggestion of things. So the setup for the movie is then you've got a character played by a very young Frances McDormand, who happy wife who's in abusive like relationship. Character played by Dan Hedder, who people know from Clueless as the father and various.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, quite a few familiar faces in this film. You've got also Emmerich Walsh. He's in it, so he's quite a well-known character actor. But so she's in a loveless marriage, and she's having an affair with this like younger guy, and the Dan Hayder character gets wind of this through like a private investigator, and he considers having the guy bumped off. In fact, he hires the guy to have him bumped off. Now, I won't say much more than that because that's the setup. Anything else is spoilers, but it sort of follows what happens from that point onwards. And just to describe the film, as I said, it's very low budget, which definitely helps with the mood and the atmosphere. It has a very distinct stylistic look to it, sparse sort of use of spaces, some great direction, some great shots, some great music, very strong cast. Like Frances McDormand, who has gone on to have a great actress, has gone on to have an excellent career. But even back here early in her career, you can see how good she is at being very vulnerable, but also being very strong and tough at points in the movies. And it's got a lot of the distinctive characteristics of what you think of as classic Coen Brothers, where it does have this pitch black, very nihilistic humor to it to go along with the more chilling tenseness of like the thriller genre. So there are sort of some funny lines in there as well. There's some oddball lines, because oddball, that's definitely a characteristic you associate with Coen Brothers at their best. So quite surreal, because without giving away spoilers, at one point it does suggest that there could be something supernatural going on, or something just a bit weird outside of like the norm, and it never really goes there, but it definitely implies that there could be at one point. Compelling thriller, a very edge of your seat thriller with a great cast of characters and nice use of music, because for a lot of the movie it is very silent and tense, and you're sort of straining your eyes to see what's going to happen. But then it does have this nice sort of outbursts of music here and there, which adds a bit more personality and breaks the tension quite well. But it's definitely like almost their own version of like a Hitchcockian style thriller mixed with noir. But it's a good one to see from them, just because it does have, as I said, some of the quirky, oddball stuff which you expect from Coen's, which you would see in something like Fargo or The Big Lebowski, some of their other films. But also it does have, as I said, a more like Hitchcockian style feel to it as well. So if you're into a good tense thriller, I think this is definitely a good one for you. As I said, black comedy as well, which is very, very entertaining. So really good. For a debut film, this is very impressive stuff. So that's Blood Simple.
Nice. You know, the Coen Brothers, I know off their films, obviously. You know, a lot of people do. But I think, aside from The Big Lebowski, which I only saw like bits of, I don't think I've actually seen a Coen Brothers film. So it might be something that we can visit in the future, because I've heard lots of good things. I've just never gotten around to watching one. So at some point, maybe I'll start with their debut and go from there. But they're definitely films of theirs that I do want to see and have a look at. And like I said, I hear nothing but good things about most of their films. So definitely have to check some of those out at some point.
Well, yeah, and we're talking about doing seasons of different directors. So a Coen season is definitely something that will be worth doing.
Absolutely. All right. So for my number 6, I'm sticking with the theme of childhood faves, and I've gone with a very 80s classic childhood film, one which I think most of us saw, except my husband, who never saw it growing up, and I give him so much crap for this, but it is the wonderful E.T. the Extraterrestrial from 1982.
Okay. Yeah.
E.T. was, I mean, do you really even have to say much about it? I mean, it's such a great Spielberg film. It's such a fun film in and of itself. I watched it so much when I was young, growing up. I mean, just the beautiful story. You know, it's basically, you know, it's a boy and his ex story. So this time it's a boy and his alien, you know, obviously. You've got little Drew Barrymore, just so cute. E.T. himself is the definition of like ugly cute. Like you look at that alien, you go, it's like he's so cute, but he's so creepy. And the little story of like him and Elliot, you know, finding each other, bonding together, them trying to get E.T. back home. I love all the characters. Elliot is a great little character. He's such a fun little child actor. And the actor actually went on to still like do Henry Thomas. He's still working. So, you know, he wasn't just one of those child actors that disappeared. Yeah, Mike Flanagan likes him. Mike Flanagan uses him a lot in his works. So yeah, and like the little Drew Barrymore, Dee Wallace playing the mum, the single mum. There's some great comedy in E.T., especially when they're trying to hide him. There's a great sequence where he's wandering around the house and the mum's wandering around the house at the same time, and they just keep missing each other. And of course, it's got that Spielberg magic to it. You know, just I mean, there's no other way to describe it, but I think people know what you say when you say it's a Spielberg film. You know, it's feel good, it's adventure, it's family. The score of E.T. score is absolutely beautiful. And I think, again, similarly to other films that like of this decade, I think for a kid's film, this film gets quite dark in places. Like, obviously, you know, you have the government trying to find E.T. And when I was younger, I always used to get really freaked out by the way that Elliot and E.T. kind of bond to each other, so that when E.T. starts to get sick, Elliot starts to get sick. And it like used to really freak me out. And there are some really like scary sequences in this film, but there's also so many iconic sequences in this film as well. Of course, the bicycle, you know, race and the bicycle jump is one of the most iconic like shots of the 80s. I mean, Spielberg even uses it for his production company, Amblin. You know, that's the thing. And I love all the takeoffs off it. You know, obviously my favorite takeoff is Stranger Things, where instead of the bikes flying, they flip the van. I just thought that was such a fun take on that. And of course, you know, it's got that, I mean, I'm going to give it because it's E.T. I'm assuming everyone's seen it, but it's got one of the most beautiful and bittersweet endings. And this was kind of, as a kid, this was one of my first introductions to an ending that wasn't fully happy. You know, like it was happy because E.T. was going home, but it was sad because he had to leave Elliot. And, you know, whenever I revisit this film, I just get such a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's just one of those films that just fills me with like joy and comfort, and it just makes me feel like I'm a little kid again. And I think, yeah, like I said, I think a lot of people our age would have grown up with this, except for Stephen. And you know, I could not get over that when he told me he never saw E.T. I was like, what kind of depraved childhood did you have that no one showed you E.T.? But yeah, it's just one of those beautiful films. It's one of my favorite Spielberg films. I think this is him when like really weaving his family magic into this movie, and it's just every time I revisit it, it just gives me that same feeling from when I watched it as a child. So it'll always be in my top 10 of the 80s films, and I just love it to death. So that is my number 6, E.T. the Extraterrestrial.
Very nice, yeah. I can't argue with this one because I grew up on it, and at a certain age, it is a very moving, at times very like heartbreaking movie.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that he was doing around this time, Spielberg, is he was definitely introducing like moral type stories for kids. So he's working that into his movies where they are a little bit darker than you would expect. Yeah. Or at least there's a message to do with having to accept things dying or at least accepting them. Life doesn't always stay the same, and sometimes you lose friends and that, like they drift apart or they just have to leave for whatever reason. 70s, 80s Spielberg, on to the early 90s, definitely the peak of his career where he was pretty much unstoppable. So many great films, so many gems of movies, but this is as a family film, this is right up there without a doubt. And you're right, yeah, that actor has had a little bit of a career, because I'm pretty sure he was in this movie, The Fever, I was watching the other night.
Okay.
She's like, I don't know, this weird sort of cult movie directed by Alex Winter, you know, the guy out of Ted.
Ted? Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, he's directed a few movies. I don't recommend this one. It was pretty dull, but yeah, I'm pretty sure he was the lead in that one. My number 6 is another Spielberg movie. And I'm going to do the music, the classic John Williams music, which I don't know, you might rate, but it's dun 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 do 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 do.
Oh, it's ringing a bell, but not 100%.
Well, it could be my rendition of it. But, I mean, I've got 3 movies to choose from, to be fair, in this series, but it is the original Indiana Jones.
Yes, yeah. I just got it. It just landed before you said it. Yeah.
Yeah. Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. So from 1981, right at the start of the decade, this was the first part of the original trilogy. And now, more recently, we've got a part 4, which kind of sucked. And we've got a part 5, which isn't going to be directed by Spielberg, but James Mangold, which is on its way. Harrison Ford in one of his most iconic roles as the archaeologist, Dr. Jones. And it's a series of movies which is a love letter to like Saturday morning serials and B movies. And just one of the things you think about when it comes to classic Spielberg is that sense of adventure, that sense of fun, and just going on this adventure where there's going to be lots of ups and downs. You know, you're going to have sort of romantic like escapades. You're gonna have dangerous like villains. You're gonna have like creatures popping up here and there. So it's a really fun movie, but like we said with Jurassic Park, he likes to inject moments of horror and tense scenes as well. And this was the movie that sort of started off, I think, that phase of him doing really fun adventure style movies. One interesting side note is it's sort of funny how real archaeologists have actually said that this depiction is very true to life when it comes to, which I just can't believe. You would have thought, totally movie fantasy, but they have said, like, real archaeologists, and the depiction is quite like realistic, but. Whatever the case may be, it's a fantastic series of movies, the original trilogy anyway. And Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of the things I like about the films as well is how they dip into different parts of history. So I think that's a lot of fun watching it as like an 80s movie, or watching it like nowadays. It's fun the way they use history and how it becomes like a globe-tropping sort of genre, like series of movies where it's dipping into different countries, different cultures. But Harrison Ford in that role is just so charismatic, so charming. It's a character, if it was played by anybody else, you would probably hate the character, but because it's him, you just love the character. And there's some great physical fight scenes involving him, a great sense of danger. Like, there are scenes where you legitimately think he's getting his ass kicked, he's in real danger. And there's a lot of good, like, pratfalls and, like, slapstick humor as well. So it does draw on, like, older genres as well as, like, B movies and serials. I think it does draw on, like, slapstick comedy as well at times, like some of the fight sequences and the way they play out. You know, like in this movie, there's a scene with him, I think, on a conveyor belt, and that feels very sort of slapstick. Or you've got the scene with him and the big, like, guy with the muscles, and it's when they're fighting and it's near the aeroplane and they're trying to get the aeroplane to set off, and it's the one that ends up with like the propeller basically killing the guy and blood sort of it's pretty graphic, the end of that scene. But the way that scene plays out with him trying to overcome this big mountain another guy. That feels quite sort of slapstick and comedic as well. But Raiders of the Lost Ark is pretty much a perfect adventure-style movie. You've also got a compelling romance in that movie with him and Karen Allen. Like, they just have great chemistry. It's a great back and forth. And she's no lightweight. Like, she's very good at playing the romantic lead, but she's also a very sparky, independent romantic lead as well. She
like that.
gives as good as she gets as well. You've got good supporting characters like the Den and Elliot character, and also it's a really dark movie that at times people forget how dark this movie is with certain scenes. You've got classic scenes like the scene where they get trapped in the tomb underground, and you've got all the snakes, and Indy notoriously hates snakes, and then you've got that you've got that big final set pieces with the face being melted, basically, which is really dark. But once again, classic practical effects. That scene wouldn't be half as good as, obviously in the 80s it wasn't really an option anyway, but if they use like CGI computer, it wouldn't be. That scene looks so authentic, so good because of the practical effects. Wonderful music from John Williams, as I said. I like all three of the original movies. I've actually got a little bit of a hot take because Temple of Doom, the second film, might actually be my second favorite, and most people would say it's the third film. Like, most people would say Last Crusade is either the best film or the second best film after Raiders. So it's a bit of a hot take. Like, I think I really enjoy Temple of Doom, despite the racism, which is kind of crazy. Them going off to India and eating all sorts of unsavory meals and like frosted, is it goat's brains or
dear,
something along that line. It's a hilarious scene anyway. Yeah, it's good stuff. But I actually really enjoy Temple of Doom. The opening to Temple of Doom might be one of my favourite film openings ever, but Raiders of the Lost Ark is still the best Indiana Jones film, I think. I rewatched it quite recently, and it holds so well. So that's my number 6.
Nice. I've only seen one Indiana Jones film, and I never watched another one because that one traumatized me for life. I was 5 years old. I was at a sleepover, and they decided to put on Temple of Doom. And I never got over that scene with the heart being ripped out and then the guy being thrown into the furnace. And oh my God, just no.
Pretty dark stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. And when you're 5, no, it was very, very bad. So I probably will watch them at some point because, it's Spielberg. It looks like a lot of fun. But yeah, Temple of Doom kind of scarred me for life. So I never quite went back after that. But obviously you hear nothing about good things, especially just for the first 3. And, Spielberg at the helm, you can't really go wrong. So maybe at some point we'll visit them on the channel and have a look and see if Temple of Doom is still as traumatizing as it was when I was 5, because I have never gotten that image out of my head. It just, it was like it was seared in my brain forever, and I just could not deal with it. Oh, so dark. The face melting scene, I know of because they actually do a takeoff in, of all things, Scrubs. They have a scene where, someone does the face melting thing from that one. So that's very cool. And I like that it links to my number 6. We're both, Spielberg, obviously. Well, at some point we'll do a Spielberg season because so much goodness there. Like, such a rich vault to choose from. So that's really great.
I do have a fun fact from that first movie, which is there's quite a famous scene where, like, Harrison Ford, Dr. Jones, is being chased through this, like, alley that they're in, like, some foreign city. And at one point he gets confronted with a guy with a sword, and the guy's flipping the sword about. And he just shoots him, basically.
I've heard of this,
so good. But the fun fact behind that is the reason that scene ended like that is because Harrison Ford had a cold or something that day, so he couldn't really do anything physical. Just shoot him. Yeah.
That's awesome. Oh, very cool. I love stuff like that. I love
Yeah.
little behind the scenes like that when they make it just makes the scene that much better when you watch it. Ah, that's
Yeah.
awesome. Alrighty. So we're moving into top five territory now, and I am continuing with my childhood faves. I warned you there'd be quite a few on this list. So this is a little musical from 1982, and that is the musical movie Annie. So Little Orphan Annie got
nice.
a musical adaptation. Again, another film that I have been watching since I was a child. I love musicals, all musicals, stage musicals, like movie musicals. So I loved Annie as a kid. I loved singing all of the songs. Tomorrow, It's a Hard Knock Life, and just the story of Little Orphan Annie. You know, being in the orphanage and then being taken to Daddy Warbucks' house and entering this life of like richness and privilege. Great supporting cast. You've got Carol Burnett, who is absolutely hilarious as Miss Hannigan, who is the evil lady who runs the orphanage, drunk all the time, which you don't pick up on as a child, but you get older and you're like, oh, you're not just being stupid, you're actually drunk. You should not be taking care of children. And this was the first role I ever really saw Tim Curry in. A very young, very skinny Tim Curry is in this, along with Bernadette Peterson, and he plays a bad guy because, of course he does, because it's Tim Curry. But Annie is just one of those kind of fun films that's, you know, it's not too deep. There's not too much going on, but you come for the music, you come for the numbers, for the dance numbers, for all of the over the top stuff. And it's very heartwarming, you know. It's again, it's one of those family films of, you know, found family. What does it mean to be a family? What does it mean to be an orphan and be taken in by someone? You really feel the bond between Annie and Daddy Warbucks like growing, and like it's really beautiful the way they form this father-daughter relationship. They also have a part where they visit President Eisenhower, and he is played by I've forgotten the actor's name, but Richard from Gilmore Girls. Edward Herman.
Yeah.
Yes, he plays Eisenhower. And I remember the last time I watched it, I didn't recognize him at first because he's very skinny in this. And I'm used to seeing him as Richard, where he's quite bigger. But that's a fun scene when Annie goes to visit the president. And you've got because you've got Miss Hannigan kind of working against Annie and trying to sabotage her, and Tim Curry and Bernadette Peterson. And so you've got this kind of like little villainous trio that are always kind of running alongside in the movie. So it's really fun to see like their evil schemes alongside what's happening with Annie. And then you have like this really fun climax, which actually, again, gets a little bit dangerous. Like Annie's in genuine danger in the climax, and you actually are fearing for her life at certain points. So again, 80s kids movies, they got fairly dark. Like it's like we were not afraid to scare the kids in the 80s. Maybe that's why so many 80s kids grow up to be horror lovers, because we were all raised on like these horrific movies that are paraded as kids movies but are actually traumatizing. But yeah, Annie was just one of those films that I just watched a lot as a child, had every line to every song memorized, used to drive my parents crazy running around the house singing them all the time. And again, it's one of those films that when you rewatch it, it holds up. You know, it's still a really fun, wholesome film. Lots of really fun, like the kid actors in it are actually really good. They cast all the orphan girls really well. They're all really fun. They all have like their distinct personalities and individualism and different mannerisms and everything. Some of the song and dance numbers are insane. It's a Hard Knock Life, which is sung in the orphanage, has girls doing like backflips off of balconies and like all of these crazy acrobatics. And like I said, it's got a really heartwarming story at the heart of it. And like one of those movies that gives you a nice happy ending where you can just feel warm and fuzzy and a little bit cheesy, because you do love a good happy ending. And yeah, I still revisit this one often. The new remake, I still need to see. I do actually want to check it out. It does look quite interesting, but I don't think anything's ever going to really beat the original, which is just so classic and so much fun. And again, just another childhood fave of mine that I grew up watching. So that is Annie from 1982, my number 5.
Okay. This is a funny one because I don't remember it that well. I definitely remember scenes from it, and I've seen clips from it.
Yeah.
And I think because it was originally out the decade I was sort of born, I can't remember if I've actually seen it all the way through. It might just be one where I've seen bits from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I obviously know the reputation and some of the big scenes and the big songs, and it's Albert Finney, right? You said played Daddy. Yes,
that's Daddy Warbucks. He's actor, so good. Yeah,
wonderful actor, and I'll say just on the side thing, but I don't know if this is a popular opinion or not, but I really like that hip hop version they did of A Hard Knock Life.
Yes,
Years
Jay-Z.
later,
Yeah.
Jay-Z,
I actually don't mind
I
that
thought that
either,
was really good.
It is
Yeah.
actually kind of funky. I don't mind that one.
Yeah. This show Channel 4 did years ago, like the 100 Top Musicals, which you might be interested in
Yeah,
watching.
that would be awesome. I might have to check that out.
Yeah, it was shown in 2 parts, and it's a good one for fans of musicals. And
nice. Well,
because it's 100, there's a really broad range.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
They even include the Buffy musical, which I thought was really cool and
well deserved.
It's right,
absolutely
well deserved. Absolutely.
Yes.
Number 5, I'm going to the sci-fi genre this time, sort of returning to it in a way because Videodrome was definitely sci-fi, but again, one of the big iconic staples of 80s cinema, and I'm just going to say it, I'll be back.
Very nice.
It is the Terminator. Of an unpopular opinion, I still prefer the first Terminator, even though I think Judgment Day is an excellent sequel, and I can see why people say it's even better than the original. But I just think as the original idea and the storytelling in the original film is a little bit better. And it's definitely the role that made Arnie iconic and one of the coolest actors in Hollywood. And I know he gets stick for not being the best actor in the world, but I actually do think as the Terminator, he does some pretty good physical acting, like the way he moves his body and the way he sells certain things and just certain line deliveries. It's almost... because he is quite a limited actor, it's almost like the perfect role for him. But
it really is. It
was one of those movies that made the idea of Scream villains as being both terrifying and cool. I think it was one of the ones to really do that. And just to make the villain of the piece this terrifying android who just seemed unstoppable, actually quite cool and engaging just because of some of the one-liners and the way he reacts to things, like when he kind of repeats swear words back at people because he's just heard them and he's just computed and this is the way you interact with people. Just things like, I want your clothes, your boots, that sort of stuff. Just stuff like that. It's really cool. But I also like the movie because in many ways it feels like a slasher movie, like the format of it, even though it is like full sci-fi and action and thriller. But it also like scenes like that scene in like the police station where he literally is stalking through the police station.
Yeah, and he's like unstoppable.
But that almost feels like a slasher style scene. But also it's a movie with a lot of heart. It's a movie with a really good like character drama and story. I think Linda Hamilton is a great example of like an 80s heroine as Sarah Connor. And that's something James Cameron deserves credit for, really putting a female character like that front and center. And she has a really good arc in that movie where at the start of the movie she's just a regular girl who's thrown into this ridiculous, scary situation. But by the end of the movie she has to learn to grow up and she has to learn to be this extraordinary sort of warrior and independent woman. And it's such a satisfying journey seeing her alongside Kyle Reese. But also it's just Cameron at his best, where he's come up with these really futuristic ideas, really exciting ideas to do with the past and the future, how the past can influence the future and different ripples through time. The end of the movie, I think, is so perfect, but it's cast to perfection. As I said, I think a big appeal is the fact that Arnie as the Terminator is so scary, but he's also so cool as well. Like,
he's great. He's so great in that role.
So great. But that's also why I think the sequel is so good, because just having that idea of making the Terminator look the same, like the good Terminator, but just flip it around.
Yeah.
And it works so well because he doesn't really have to change his performance that much. It works
No.
perfectly. And Robert Patrick was a great choice as the villain in that movie as well. But
Yeah.
it's a very strong sequel. Personally, I still have a preference for this movie, though. You've got some great heart-racing 80s music as well, some great synth music.
Yes.
Obviously, synth is a big part of 80s cinema as well.
Mm-hmm.
You've got some great music. A great story, a timeless sci-fi epic, I think, and just some really great set pieces and visual moments. So, yeah, that is the Terminator, my number 5.
That's a great pick. I can't argue with that. I am, with the majority. I do tend to prefer T2, and I have seen T2 more than I've seen the Terminator. But I mean, you can't have the sequel without the original. So, we wouldn't have that amazing movie if we didn't have this first one. And it is fun to go back and rewatch the first one after you love the second one so much and like remember that, oh no, he was the villain originally. Like he was the bad guy and he was like an unstoppable force in that movie. And I agree with you that Sarah Connor gets a great arc. And again, I think a lot of people like the second movie because in the second movie she's more like Ellen Ripley-like. She's become like toughened and she's had like her badass makeover. But that first movie is fantastic. And Cameron, we all know that I have a massive heart-on for Cameron. I love that man. I just think he's amazing in what he can do with film.
Like
and
the
I
character
think,
out of Scream 2 then.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Exactly. That's pretty much me. I mean, and yeah, did you know that the Terminator came from like a fever dream he had? He was like recovering from surgery or something in the hospital, and he had this dream of like this robot on fire that had come to like kill him, and that became the basis for the Terminator. So I definitely got to rewatch the first one again because I haven't watched in a while. Because like I said, I usually just put T2 on because T2 is just so good. Yeah. But yeah, that first one is great, and some of the scenes you were mentioning, like I do love that scene where he's like, "I need your boots, I need your jacket," and then he gets back. What? And yeah, and I think there's some great effects in that one as well. The one where you see like his arm, that it's part of the robot arm, like that's a great example of, again, 80s special effects. And yeah, very well directed. I've said this before, but yeah, so a YouTuber that I follow says Cameron's really good at putting normal people in extraordinarily scary situations and making us root for them as they try to survive. And I'm like, yeah, that's really at the crux of so many Cameron films. Yeah. It's just putting people in survival situations. And he's so good at filming that action and making you feel like that scene where, when Kyle Reese first comes across Sarah and they're racing away from a Terminator, like in the car, like you feel like the tension there. You can feel you always feel the danger. And yeah, I think that's a great pick. I love that. My favorite movies of all time. I first saw this as a teenager and just everything about this movie just struck me so deeply. And that is Dead Poets Society from 1989. Okay. So this is, in my opinion, one of Robin Williams' best roles. Obviously, is John Keating. So this is set, for anyone who doesn't know, Dead Poets Society is set in the 50s at a boys' boarding school, a very rigid, very strict boys' boarding school, tradition, honor, discipline, blah, blah, blah. And Robin Williams plays the new English teacher, Mr. Keating. And it's, it's a coming of age story. So he comes into this one particular set of boys' lives and tells them about the Dead Poets Society, which was a bunch of guys going into the woods to read poetry. So when I was younger, I didn't really realize how incredibly gay this movie is. Like, this is such a metaphor for like homosexuality. Like, you watch it when you get older and you're like, how did I not pick up on all the homoerotic subtext that is going on in this movie? But it's also a really great coming of age film. I think all the characters are really endearing. You've got Ethan Hawke in one of his earliest roles playing Todd, who's a great character, who has a great character arc. Robert Leonard, I think his name is, plays Neil, who was one of my favorite characters ever. And I really related to Neil's character because he had very controlling, very strict, particularly a father. And I grew up, with a dad who was very, very controlling and very strict. And so I really identified with Neil's struggle to break free of his family. And like I said, I think Robin Williams in this role is just amazing. This was one of the Robin Williams roles that really hit me and like really stayed with me. And I watched it at a time in my life that I really needed that sort of character, the uplifting kind of, inspirational, you can do it character. Robin Williams, I think when they give him dramatic roles is so great because he takes all of that manic energy that he has for comedy and channels it into the dramatic roles and it's just so great. But of course, he's Robin Williams, so we still have scenes where he's putting on voices. We still have scenes where he's a bit over the top. But yeah, I just think that he's so good in this role. Very, very beautiful, sometimes bittersweet, sometimes heartbreaking story. I won't give the ending away in case people haven't seen it, but it is a very, very powerful movie. And I remember when my mother was trying to get me to watch this movie, she kept telling me, watch Dead Poets Society, Rach. And she kept saying to me, it has the best end scene you'll ever see. And I kept going, why? How is that a selling point? And then I watched the movie and she was not wrong. Dead Poets Society, that end scene is honestly, it's one of my favorite movie endings, has me in tears every time I watch it. I just think it's so great. And it's directed by Peter Weir, who I haven't seen much of his other stuff, but Picnic at Hanging Rock was another one I saw of his that I really loved. Such a weird movie. And I think that he's really good with this movie. Like, the direction is really great. The way the story moves is really great. He coaxes some fantastic performances out of the actors, not just Robin. Like I said, the guys who are playing the students are all really good, really charismatic, and just a lot of fun to watch. And, you know, you get a little bit of a poetry lesson while you're watching this movie. You know, you get to hear different bits of poetry and Shakespeare plays and things like that. And yeah, it's just one of those movies that has stayed with me for years and years. I used to watch it like every single weekend for like a solid year because I fell in love with it so much. And we had the VHS, so I like just wore it out, just rewatching this movie over and over. So this one is probably like one of the more personal movies on this list for me, because it was a movie that did help me through a bit of a rough time in my teen years. And like I said, Robin Williams' character, that particular character was very, very close to me and was very important to me at that point in time. So this movie's definitely stayed with me like throughout my life. Probably still one of my favorite films now. I actually haven't been able to watch it since Robin Williams died because I just, for a few years after, I was like, it's just too much. But I think now I could probably give it a go and give it another watch. But yes, that's my number 4, Dead Poets Society from 1989.
Okay. I've seen it, but it's been a very long time, so I can't really comment. It's one I need to rewatch, and it's interesting what you say about the ending, because I think some people find the ending a bit too cheesy. Like, I have heard that complaint, but okay.
It works for me.
It works for you. That's fair enough. Yeah. But yeah, I do like the director a lot, and I sort of grew up with him. Not just his movies, but also the sitcom Mork and Mindy.
Mork and Mindy.
That's quite a big part of my childhood as well. So that's pretty cool. My number 4, I've gone for one on the more arty indie route this time, and I've gone with a Wim Wenders film, which is called Paris, Texas. Have you heard of this movie?
You know what? I've heard the title, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah,
I know nothing else, but I have heard the title.
So I'll describe it. So Harry Dean Stanton plays a guy who, well, obviously he plays a guy. He plays a guy who, at the start of the movie, shows up out of the blue back to his home. He's been missing for years, sort of feared dead, or they didn't know exactly what was happened to him. He's got a wife. He's also got an older brother played by Dean Stockwell, and great cast. But they've been, so there's big mystery over where he's been all this time. So a lot of the drama of the film is about him settling back in, about them trying to get to the bottom of where he's been, what's happened to him. And one of the big things about the story is this idea that he's been living a second life while he's been away all these years, and how that eventually, the secrets of that second life start to come out, and how it's sort of spoilers, but like the second half of the film does revisit like where he's been and that second life and stuff. So it's all about the drama with him and his brother played by Dean Stockwell. His wife, former, been through a lot of stress, not knowing where he was, what happened to him, if he was even still alive, and then just what she's put through emotionally, because he comes back and he just isn't the same guy than she remembers. So, and that's a big part of the drama of the film, the fact that he does come back and he's completely different. But It's a beautiful film, a beautiful drama, very quirky, very independent. It has this, like, the setting of the film, this small town setting off the beaten track, definitely has a little bit of a quirky Twin Peaks style feel. And once again, it's like a Western sort of setting, sort of Southern Western. So again, it has that classic American, like, sort of an epic feel, but also, as I said, much more independent and offbeat, and much more of a like an engrossing, slow building character drama. It is about it being very slow and pacey, and much more about the characters and their lives and the mystery and that sense of just not knowing what is going on, which makes it so compelling. It's one of Wim Wenders' best films. I mean, I think it might be one of my favourite films ever. Not just from the decade, but it is just so beautifully shot. There's some great use of colours. There's a really, in the second half of the film, one of the big scenes, which it's just like the way he uses, because you've got also a character played by Natasha Kinski in the movie, and she has like a pink sweater in a particular scene, and just the way he shoots that sweater and the choice to make it a pink sweater is very distinct as well. So certain visual cues. But Harry Dean Stanton is great casting because he plays this character almost as like an alien, like just stumbling back into this town and not really remembering his old life, or he only has like bits and pieces of information. So he's a classic like of oddball, confused style character where, there's just a mystery to him and the sense of unknown. And it's sort of fun because him and Dean Stockwell, I think, make for very convincing brothers. Because sometimes Dean Stockwell, I think, plays more oddballs, but in a way, it's a more of a straight role for Dean Stockwell. And he obviously has to try and whip the brother into shape and say, "Hey, you've been missing all these years. You've got this life now, and your wife has been missing you." Just things like that. So they make a very compelling, like, odd couple type pairing as the brothers. As I said, very good castings. You've got beautiful music. It's beautifully filmed. And just certain movies where sometimes if a movie plays out and it's very slow, and sometimes you think it's a bit plodding and it's like, come on, get to the point. But this is definitely one of the movies where a slower pace makes it all the more rewarding. Like, it definitely justifies that slow pace. Also, I think some of the themes you could read into it are really interesting, because I sort of feel Wim Wenders is like a German director, and some of his early films he did do in his like native country. But he's now done quite a lot of movies in America, so this is obviously one. And I think part of the theme of the movies and like almost the title, Paris, Texas, I think it's almost like commenting on his experience as a European director working in America, and how the European style traditionally is very different to the Hollywood style. So it's almost, I think, a comment on him trying to stamp his mark on American movies. And so you can almost see that as like a metaphor with the Harry Dean Stanton character as this like oddball who doesn't really remember his past life. And just in this quirky small town, just feeling like a bit of an outsider. But I think also just that idea, Paris, Texas, because you couldn't get any more two different cultures, really. Read that as being at the heart of what the film is saying. But yeah, very, very engrossing film, very powerful. Some great performances, as I said, some great music. But it's very distinct. Like, it's one of those movies from the 80s that it has its own unique style, uniquely sort of Wim Wenders style movie. So that's Paris, Texas, my number 4.
Very interesting. Yeah, like I said, I heard the title, knew literally nothing about the movie. So that's a very interesting premise, and it does sound like it has a really strong cast. So it might have to be one that I check out at some point. But that's cool. I like that, kind of like a different type of movie on your list. So very nice. All right, so for my number 3, we're going back to childhood favorites, and no laughing when I say this title. This is honestly my favorite kids movie of all time.
Okay.
Absolutely love it, and that is Disney's The Little Mermaid from 1989.
I thought you might have this one.
Yeah. So, like I said, this is my favorite kids film of all time. This was the very first movie I ever saw in the cinemas. I was 4 years old, and I remember going to see this. And I have just always loved it. I think Disney goes through phases. They go up and down. But The Little Mermaid was kind of a start of what they call the Renaissance era. So all of the movies that I grew up with, The Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Mulan, all of those came about because of The Little Mermaid. I just love this film. I've known the real story of The Little Mermaid since I was young, so I always knew that the original story does actually end with her dying. So I always liked that the Disney film found a way to give her like a happy ending, because you don't want to see death and destruction in a Disney film. And I really do think this is one of their best animated films. Ariel is a great protagonist. She was really one of the first Disney princesses to have like her own personality and like really strong desires and a really strong like dynamic. Again, another character that I very much related to. My dad even looks a little bit like King Triton, especially now that his hair's gone completely white. So I always used to relate to the Ariel and Triton dynamic, and the whole thing of not feeling like a fish out of water, which I think everyone does at a certain point in time. So we find these characters that remind us of ourselves and kind of bond to them. And so Ariel was definitely a very important character to me as a child. I think that this has got some of the most fun Disney music. You've got Under the Sea, you've got Part of Your World, you've got Kiss the Girl. These are all like really, really great fun songs. The animation is beautiful. I really miss Disney 2D animation, because I think Disney 2D animation is just gorgeous. And I've watched so much behind the scenes for The Little Mermaid, because I have like the special Blu-ray with all the extra stuff, and just hearing about all the attention to detail that they paid while, because they kept saying, we're very aware that this is underwater, so we need to make everything look like it's underwater, not like just like they're just swimming against like a flat background. So I think they said they drew like hundreds of thousands of bubbles hand drawn in that movie to get the feel of the ocean, to get the feel of the momentum through the ocean. I think all of the ocean life is really great. Under the Sea is like one of the best songs ever, and that whole song and dance is just fantastic. Ursula as the Sea Witch, one of my favorite Disney villains. She is fantastic. Oh, and as her actress always said, she's not actually an octopus. She's a squid. She only has 6 tentacles because it was too expensive to draw 8. That's basically the explanation. Also, I love the fact that her design is based on divine. Like, that is just too cool. That a Disney movie. Yeah, but the Disney movie villain is based on a drag queen. So John Waters is actually quite a big fan of Ursula as a character and The Little Mermaid as a film. Again, not much to say, because it's a Disney film. There's not that much to it. It's just a fun little family romp with all the Disney staples. Like I said, this one really ushered in the Renaissance era of Disney, like the era that we all think is kind of the best. And the fact that this movie has stayed with me, since I was 4 years old. I mean, that's 33 years of watching this movie, and I still put it on now today and smile and sing and just have the time of my life. The remake looks terrible. I have no problem with Ariel being black, because it means I can finally kind of cosplay as her accurately, which is awesome. But the rest of it looks absolutely shocking. Like, truly, I don't. Disney live action remakes just need to stop. And the fact that now they're butchering my beloved Little Mermaid is just like, why are you doing this to me? Why would you do this to me?
Well, you never know. It might be good.
Maybe,
it might just be a bad trailer. Yeah.
I hope so. But I mean, when you look at the other Disney remakes, they're not fantastic.
The Jungle Book was good.
Original. Oh, that one was not too bad.
Yeah, I enjoyed that one. But in general, not great.
We'll see. It's just because the originals are so good. I don't know why you're touching them, especially from this era. But yeah, that's my number 3, The Little Mermaid. It stayed with me since I was a kid and will probably stay with me like forever. It's just one of those films that is just timeless. So there you have it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that because classic Disney is really
Yeah.
the best Disney for like animations, and
Mhm.
it's definitely one of those because a lot of the movies we're bringing up on our list are movies that can definitely appeal to like male and female
Yeah.
audiences. But on this occasion, obviously because of the story, it's going to appeal more to you. Like it's going to
Yeah.
appeal more. But it's a good film. It's a film that I like. The songs are very good,
Mm.
and they kind of transcend any kind of gender thing, because
Yes.
they are just really catchy, heartfelt
Well, this
songs.
was Howard Ashman, who was, a lyricist for Disney until he died of AIDS,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But yeah, like he put a
Okay.
lot of his heart and soul into this. And again, like the Part of Your World music is almost him, singing through that about his sexuality, which is actually very interesting because Hans Christian Andersen,
Okay.
who wrote the original Little Mermaid, was also gay. And the Little Mermaid is actually an allegory for silent love and having to love in pain and not being able to let that love out. So anytime anyone wants to use that whole she gave up her legs for a man voice, I want to punch them in the she gave up her voice for a man thing, I want to punch them in the face because there's so much more to this story. But yeah, no, the songs in it, Alan Menken and Howard Shore were just fantastic, and I think they were the best lyricists and composers that Disney had. They did this one, they did Beauty and the Beast, they did Aladdin, and I mean the songs from all of these movies are so iconic. So yeah, and they just still hold up today. It's fantastic.
Yeah, no, good stuff. I can't really argue with that pick, and I agree. The animation is very good. I do miss that sort of hand drawn style.
Yeah.
Now, I do think we have come a long way, and a lot of the advancements in animation I do like. I think it depends on what sort of film it is, what story you're telling.
Yes.
Because in this case, I definitely agree. Then to do underwater stuff in animation, it is going to be better hand drawn. It is going to be better. It's just going to have that more authentic feel. And same with something like The Jungle Book. Doing the jungle scenes, it's always going to be much better hand drawn and stuff. But like. I think the problem is sometimes with modern animation is I think some films they've just made them look too lifelike and too realistic. And that just takes away the imagination. And
takes you out of the experience almost.
Just the fact it is an animation, because that is one of the differences. So yeah, sometimes they go a little too crazy and make it a bit too lifelike, where you can see like literally every hair, moving and things like that. But 3 is, again, more of an art house style movie. So it's a Japanese movie, and it's a movie called Ran. And no, well, you would have heard of the director. The director is Akira Kurosawa.
Oh, yes, definitely know that director. Yes.
Seven Samurai probably is most famous movie, and Rashomon as well, a few other movies. So yeah, this is one of his later movies. The story is actually loosely based on King Lear from Shakespeare. And he actually did a few like adaptations of Shakespeare plays, like Throne of Blood is another adaptation of a Shakespeare one. So yeah, mid-80s. So the story setup is you have this aging warlord who, at the start of the movie, I think he realizes that he's not got too long left now to live. So this sort of motivates him to like kind of lay down the rules of the land with his 3 sons and to assign them all roles, and like, because you've got like different castles, things like that. So he assigns like different castles to them. But crucially, he makes himself still like the head of the family. And he kind of sets up that his older son is going to be the one who succeeds him when he eventually dies. But crucially, the older son doesn't really want that responsibility. So what happens is like him suddenly out of nowhere coming up with these rules and setting things up, saying this is the way this is going to be. It starts causing all sorts of friction with the 3 sons, and eventually it leads to them like turning on him, basically, and that becomes the big conflict of the movie. Kurosawa movies, you get like this big epic, like almost samurai style plot, which really gets deep into like traditional Japanese culture and customs. But I think what he does really well is he uses that as like almost a critique or a way to explore some of the customs and traditions. Like this one definitely shows up quite a sexist sort of side to traditional Japanese culture and the way like a female character is portrayed at times. But it's also one where they have a little bit of fun with that, where it is quite a ripe sort of pastiche of that stuff, or critique, if you like. And where at certain times she does have certain moments where she kind of gets one over on like the male characters. But it does a good job of, on the one hand, being a very epic, very stylistic, full-blooded movie, but also definitely unveiling some of the maybe flaws of traditional Japanese cultures, or some of these customs anyway, where it's like very masculine and there's a certain tradition to things, a certain way things are expected to do. And because this is an 80s film as well, I think you have even more of a sense of that, because some of Kurosawa's earlier films, like they date back to like the 40s and 50s. So probably in those decades, watching it as a modern audience, you probably didn't have that distance so much. Time you get to the 80s, I think enough time has passed where you can sort of view it through a different lens. And I don't think his films are particularly preachy, but he's definitely poking at these things and playing certain things up and saying, yeah, this is a bit, you know, maybe not the most progressive thing in the world. And he does make his films quite entertaining. Like they do feel quite satirical at times, colourful characters. And there's a lot of themes in this. There's a lot of themes to do with like mortality and to do with coming towards the end of your life. As I said, certain ideas to do with gender and sexism, epic stylistic movies. It's a beautiful use of colour, the way it's shot. And there's a big battle scene in the middle of the movie, which is one of the greatest battle scenes I've ever seen in any movies. And haunting use of music, really great use of slow motion shots at times during the battle scenes. And I think you can see maybe with this sequence how he's maybe influenced people like Spielberg, like that battle scene in Saving Private Ryan. Obviously very different genre, but, you know, once again, sort of set around this big battle, this big war. And maybe even someone like Tarantino, you know, you can see a certain influence with the slow motion shots and very good performance from the lead actor in it, playing this aging warlord. And yeah, there's some great, really freaky visuals of him looking almost like sort of like a goblin or a demon type thing, and very haggard. So they do a great job, I think, with the makeup as well. But yeah, it's a beautiful epic of a movie. Like I said, definitely lifts a lid on some of the traditional norms of Japanese cultures, where you can have your own take on these things. His best movies. It's close to 3 hours long, but it definitely holds your attention, or it held my attention as well. Like it's very compelling to watch. So that is Ran, my number 3.
Very nice. That's a cool entry, kind of like a little bit different. I have to admit, I am a little bit basic in that I haven't seen a lot of foreign films. So it's definitely an area that I do need to catch up in and kind of expand my knowledge of. But I have obviously heard of the director, very well-known director, and the premise of the film sounds really interesting. And again, the themes that you were talking about, and you know, the look at gender in a different culture and stuff like that's always really interesting. Because you know, these issues definitely differ from, you know, the Western world through to like Asian world or European or stuff like that. So that's cool. I like that. So something a little bit different.
Yeah.
Very nice. Alrighty, so number 2, we're getting there. So my number 2 is, again, one of my favorite films ever. A little dark comedy, one of the best teen comedies I think that is out there, and that is a little film from 1988 called Heathers.
Oh,
So
good stuff.
I love Heathers. I have loved Heathers for years. First of all, you have Winona Ryder, who, well, I absolutely adore, one of my favorite actresses of all time. Christian Slater as well, doing his best Jack Nicholson impression in this movie, and he's very, very good at it. And this was basically kind of the original Mean Girls, Jawbreaker, one of those types of movies, you know. For anyone who doesn't know, the Heathers are a popular group at school comprised of 3 girls called Heather, which makes for some great dialogue and some really fun scenes with the 3 Heathers. And Winona Ryder is Veronica, who has joined the Heathers, but is not quite sure that she wants to be in the popular group, because she's learning that being in the popular group comes with all sorts of like obligations and all of this. It's almost like, I think at some point she's like, yes, it's like it's just like they're people I go to work with and our job is being popular. And now this was the 80s, so the premise of this film was that the teens start killing each other. So so the main Heather is accidentally killed by Veronica and JD, who is Christian Slater's character, and that kind of opens the gateway for them to start performing more murders. And the whole absurdity of it was kids killing each other, because this was before the era of school shootings and before, you know, the 90s when everything kind of got out of control. So it's a very, very black comedy, but I absolutely love it. I think the humor is really spot on. I think the characters are really funny. All 3 of the different Heathers have their own distinct personalities, and they're all color-coded, which I absolutely love. You have Shannon Doherty as well, a very young Shannon Doherty playing one of the Heathers. And I think it's just a really nice little snapshot into 80s teen life and what it must have been like as a teenager in that particular decade. It also touches on how we glamorize death and how we glamorize suicide, and like kind of deify those who commit suicide. For example, after the main Heather is killed, they find out that her suicide has made her even more popular, and that everyone's like kind of fawning over her even more. And you just see Veronica's just like, what is happening? It's got some great commentary on teenagers and the way that, you know, they feel suffocated, and it's got some really funny lines with regards to that. Also has a really good commentary on the hierarchy of teenagers. And I actually think that this movie, even more so than, say, a movie like Mean Girls, which is supposedly based on a book about teen popularity, I think this movie really shows how the hierarchy just changes and you can't really ever get rid of it. There's even like a moment where Veronica's like, you know, we could kill the next Heather and then someone else could take over. It could even be me, you know? So I think it really shows that quite well. Like I said, the humor in it is fantastic. So many great iconic lines. Some lines that have some really like kind of funny aneurysm moments. The main Heather at one point has a line that says, "Did you eat a brain tumor for breakfast?" She died of a brain tumor. So, you know, little things like that, it just makes you go, oh, you watch it and you're like, that's a bit of a funny aneurysm moment. But I think one of the reasons I love Heather so much is we live in an age now of such political correctness that we've almost forgotten that sometimes there is a refuge in audacity and there is a refuge in saying things that are not PC. And sometimes a movie can be funnier if that's the point. And I think Heathers, because it was made in the 80s, has the freedom to be really irreverent. It's got some lines that just would not fly today, like the "I love my dead gay son," which, by the way, great line. But I love that we have that non-PC-ness in Heathers because of the time that it was made. So you can just laugh at these really dark, inappropriate jokes, and they just work so well. And I feel like we've lost that a little bit, especially in teen dramas or teen comedies. But yeah, Heathers is it's so much fun. It's just so dark and so funny. And they made a musical of it, I think about a decade and a half ago. I've never seen the musical on stage, but I've listened to the songs, and can I just say they captured that movie perfectly. And the songs, again, very non-PC, very dark, and very much in tune with the movie. So yeah, like I said, I've loved Heathers for years. I first saw it when I was a young teen, and then I bought it on Blu-ray about 10, 15 years ago and just fell in love with it all over again. I really it really was a precursor for movies like Jawbreaker, Mean Girls, The Craft, all of the Mean Girl type movies. This is kind of where they all started. This was kind of the first one, and I really do think it is still the best one. Great performances, great humor, great story, and just a really good payoff, and I really love the ending as well. So that's my number 2, Heathers from 1988.
Yeah, that's a great pick. I'm a big fan of this movie. Like you said, it did start a whole new trend, and it was very influential and cutting edge at the time. And I agree with what you said about it being non-PC and being all the best for it. Like, it's so unfiltered and just really just jet black humor, and it's some of the best examples of dark humor, certainly from this time period, and great characters, distinct visual moments, and just some great iconic scenes and some really great example of cringe humor as well. It's a wonderful movie. Like, at times it almost feels like a full-on horror movie in certain ways, I think, which I really like. But this is Christian Slater at the peak of his powers. I think when he's playing this dangerous, sort of edgy bad boy, I think that's when he is at his best, really. It
works well for him, yes. Very good. And he's definitely channeling some Jack Nicholson in this movie. Like, you can tell. And I think it really works for the character of JD. And I think he and Winona have really good chemistry too. And so their little kind of tortured love affair, dark, thing that they have, it really works, even though it's so twisted. And I think that's down to those two leads.
Yeah, it's almost like a bit of a Sid and Nancy or Bonnie and Clyde style relationship at times. But this is when Winona Ryder was really getting on a roll, because obviously Beetlejuice was the year before this as well. So she was really like kind of getting that sort of outsider style, goth style role down to a T around this time. And my number 2, I've gone with a classic, and a classic which has definitely stood the test of times. So a movie which is not only one of the greatest sci-fi movies of that genre, but also one of the greatest sort of coming of age and adventure style movies. And that is the original Back to the Future from 1955.
Nice.
I don't really need to describe this movie, and it's probably a movie we'll do at some point on the channel, probably do the whole trilogy. But it is such a wonderful genre-defining movie with a nice mix of genres. As I said, you've sort of got a great coming-of-age tale because of the Marty McFly character, and boy, did they nail the casting with Michael J. Fox. He is just so charismatic and just so likable and so smooth and slick, but with like a naivety and kind of vulnerability as well. That's what he really brings. That gives that character like a likability. Also, these movies in general, but I'll just say the first one, it does a great job of really making you believe you are in the time period of the movie. Like, just every little details, the music of the era, the clothes, the way people were dressed and appear, the haircuts, but also like the style of the buildings and everything, and when he jumps to the future or to the past, as it is, like that classic 50s style diner, the Manhattan stuff, like just many of the styles and many of the classic trademarks, and then when he's like back in the 80s back home, it looks a lot like the 80s. And I think that's something we've lost in movies and TV, where a lot of times when they're doing like period pieces where it's supposed to be a certain decade, you're not actually that convinced it is that decade. Like, they don't really make the effort to go into those little touches.
Yeah, I agree.
Authentic. But this is something the Back to the Future movies do so well. But This is just classic storytelling, which you got in a lot of great 80s movies, where the script is just a perfect script from start to finish. It's a great example of that classic Hollywood 3-act structure where you get cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
You get a proper journey, like A to Z sort of thing. And you get, as I said, cause and effect. You get little details in the plot, which they then return to later on and pay it off. It is just such an airtight script. And I think one of the reasons I love Back to the Future so much, and the reason it is so timeless, is it feels like an 80s movie in as like how advanced it is, like the sci-fi elements and the fantastical elements and just the charm and the charisma of 80s movies. But then it also has a very, what at the time would have been a very old-fashioned sensibility in the story, in the heart of the movies. And because it is jumping around decades over the three movies, then it is always going to be very nostalgic. And that's something the movies do very well, where it's definitely referencing or nodding to certain genres, because obviously in the third movie it's set in a western. It's a western type setting.
That's right, I forgot that.
Yeah. And there's lots of fun like referencing or nodding to like western, because there's that classic joke in the movie where he calls himself Clint Eastwood. And of course at that point they would have no idea who Clint Eastwood was, so
That's
jokes
awesome.
like that are so good. But yeah, the trilogy as a whole I think are fantastic. Like parts 2 and 3 do a great job of once again feeling like Back to the Future movies, but also doing their own thing, like just adding little bits to like the mythology into the series. And 2's the one that is very dark, like that is the darkest of the three. And 3's very divisive. Like some people don't like 3, like many people see it as like the weaker one. I actually really like 3 a lot. I think they're excellent movies in their own right. And you have to remember, when you're looking at a trilogy, you are considering all 3 films as telling this complete story over three films. So the fact of the matter is you've got one masterpiece of a movie, which is the first movie, and then you've got 2 very good sequels, 2 excellent sequels. So it's a trilogy where for me there is no weak movie, which is very rare in a movie trilogy. And I said those sequels do their own thing and add to the overall story of the trilogy. And there are people who, like a friend of mine for example, he likes part 2 the most of the 3 movies. So such a timeless movie. You've got so many quotable lines, so many great characters. I've not even mentioned like the Doc Brown character, but Christopher Lloyd is so wonderful as Doc Brown. It's kind of where I think movies and TV's got this idea of sort of a kooky, like mad scientist character. He really started that whole trend. And you've also got one of the great like oddball like buddy type relationships with Doc Brown and Marty, who make for such a great pairing. Once again, like some of the other films we've talked about on this list, it's a much darker film than you would expect. Like there are darker scenes in it. There's scenes that are quite tense, like the clock tower scene. That is such a compelling, tense scene to watch. Again, you've got wonderful music in it. Eric Strauss was almost cast as the main.
I was going to mention that because when you said that Michael J. Fox is so perfectly cast, I was like, yeah, well, they almost went with Eric Stoltz, which no.
And from what I hear from like the footage of him, like, because obviously nothing against him, he's a pretty good actor, but he just was completely wrong for that role.
No,
like.
No, it would not have worked.
Because one of the stories I like from the book is that apparently Strauss was taking it super seriously, where he had to stay character all the time.
Actually, that sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, and Christopher Lloyd does this funny line when someone comes up to him and mentions like Eric, and have you seen Eric or something? And he's just like, who's Eric? I thought his name was Marty, because he's just going around. We're going to go for a different actress from Marty's girlfriend. And they changed the casting because it was a bit of an old-fashioned thing where the actress they were going to go for was much taller and him. So it's that old-fashioned.
Well, it's Michael J. Fox, so
He grew up on Back to the Future, and it holds up so well. The whole trilogy does, really. It's a really fun, just feel-good movie. It's for feel-good cinema. This is one of the best things you have, and Michael J. Fox is just so good in it, really. Him and Christopher Lloyd are a great team. And another one which has got a recent musical, which I do want to check out at some point.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's one that's been years in the making and just kept getting put off. But Robert Zemeckis is heavily involved.
The films when I was a child. I remember watching them a lot when I was younger, but I haven't seen them probably in a good 20 years, so it might be time for a rewatch to revisit, because I only have very vague flashes of the movies. I don't really remember like a lot. And like just a few performances stick out. Like I can remember Crispin Glover, you know, as the dad, as the awkward George, was it? Yeah, the dad, and so I can remember bits and pieces. Also, of course, the town that they're in is Stars Hollow. So that's always fun to have a look at that. So so that's very cool.
Oh, do you mean they use the same set?
The same set, the same set.
I didn't know that. Actually.
No, next time you watch it, watch carefully. It's Stars Hollow. So that's really cool. So we're getting down to number one. Now I thought that I wouldn't have any honorable mentions, but you've actually mentioned a couple that I wanted to do honorable mentions on, and I remembered a couple that I almost put on this list. So should we do our honorable mentions and then we can do our number ones?
Yes. Okay.
All right. So I'll do mine first because you said that you had a lot. I've only got 4 on my list, so I'll just throw these in. So once you mentioned it, I had to put Dream Warriors as an honorable mention because, absolutely fantastic sequel. And like we said, it's as good, if not better than the original. I just have the original on the list because, like I said, it's the OG, and you just can't go past that sometimes. So definitely got that. Terminator as well. Once you said that, I was like, yes, how did I not think of Terminator? Again, I think it's because I love T2 more than the original, but the original is so good. Like you said, made Arnie, you know, the star that he is, very well cast in that role. Lots of fun, lots of horror in it. Cameron can do horror really well. Just a really great, solid action film. And now the 2 that I almost put on my list, but just missed out because of the others. The first one is Stand By Me, which I absolutely do love, based on the novella The Body by Stephen King. Beautiful little coming-of-age story. River Phoenix, rest in peace. What's his name from Star Trek? Always forget his name. Will Wheaton. That's the one.
Is he in there? I didn't realize.
Yes, very young Will Wheaton, Corey Feldman, and a very young, very pudgy little Jerry O'Connell. It's so cute.
Much better than he was in Scream 2.
Yes, definitely. And of course, you've got Kiefer Sutherland as well. And it's just such a beautiful little coming-of-age story. I think the performances from all 4 of the boys are really good. A really great story about friendship. And you've got some iconic shots, like the kids on the train tracks is obviously become quite an iconic shot. Stranger Things kind of did a little reference to it. And I've just always really loved Stand By Me. And then my last honorable mention is the wonderful Joel Schumacher outing, The Lost Boys. Because if you're going to do cheesy 80 vampires, you absolutely want a shirtless, oiled up saxophone player in the movie. I mean, why not? Also, you've got those awesome 80 mullets, the chaps that they wear, plus all the homoerotic tension between the two, like Kiefer Sutherland and Jason Patrick. I don't think that was intentional, or maybe it was. It's Joel Schumacher, so you never know. But The Lost Boys is just such a cheesy, ridiculous, over-the-top outing that you just can't help but love it, because it's just, I think it's Joel Schumacher at like his most unhinged. He's just having the best time of his life doing that movie. So I had to throw that in as an honorable mention because I do have such a soft spot for The Lost Boys. So those are my 4 honorable mentions. Let's hear your list. I'm very curious to hear what you've got on your list.
Yeah, because there were a few I sort of remembered as we going along wrong. Just certain things jarred my memory. But one is probably my favourite Star Trek movie, which is Wrath of Khan, Star Trek 2. And I mentioned it before, wonderful villain. And really, if you want an example of the perfect Trek movie and adventure, I think it is that movie. And it definitely has one of the most dramatic endings, like twists ever. Like the ending of that movie is so unexpected. So wonderful Trek movie. Also the Voyage Home, which is from the later 80s, Star Trek 4. That's a very good Trek movie as well, in my opinion anyway. You also have, it sort of jarred my memory with Terminator, because I know Bill Paxton has a small role, but one of my favourite horror movies probably ever is Near Dark, the Catherine Bigelow Western vampire sort of neo-noir film, which is just wonderful. Very different take on the vampire genre, and one of Catherine Bigelow's best films without a doubt. A really great cult movie in the style you just don't get anymore, which is very sad. So some others, Die Hard, definitely an honourable mention.
Oh, he didn't make it to the top 10. Oh,
Princess Bride was very close. That's another one I grew up on, and I think that would be in my list of best films ever if I did like a big list. Original Nightmare on Elm Street, that was obviously very close to making the list. Speaking of great Cameron films and great Cameron sequels, Aliens was very close. That's a wonderful sequel as well. Also, RoboCop, another great staple of 80s sci-fi, very nihilistic movie. Yeah. Again, a bit like some of the Cronenberg stuff we mentioned earlier, very satirical, cutting-edge movie, RoboCop, but very pulpy as well. Really good stuff, the original RoboCop. Also, Beverly Hills Cop. I mean, the 80s was such a great decade for Eddie Murphy. It's where you had him at his most charismatic, witty, edgy best. So the original Beverly Hills Cop in particular is a really good, entertaining action comedy. Now, that's a subgenre that's very hard to get right. And a lot of movies really fall flat when they try and do it. But if you want a good example of a great action comedy, Beverly Hills Cop ticks the boxes. Some great music in that film as well. And some really edgy humour, which, again, some of it wouldn't fly today, like the whole Michael Jackson joke when he's in the hotel. On a similar note, 48 Hours with Nick Nolte. It is an underrated movie. Also, Coming to America, I absolutely love. The Golden Child is such a crazy, silly movie, but also a very entertaining movie. Carpenter, The Thing, I mean, because Carpenter, I love him so much, and 70s, 80s Carpenter is when he was at his best, so I was very close to having The Thing because it is one of his very best, but he had a very good decade. They Live is another good Carpenter movie from the decade. Also, Big Trouble in Little China, such a fun action movie. Kick-Ass Strikes Back, the Star Wars sequels, which I don't know how you feel about it, but possibly might still be the best Star Wars movie of them all. That's certainly debatable.
I have an odd relationship with Star Wars. I only saw the original films for the first time maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Stephen made me watch them. Before then, I'd only seen the prequels. And I love a lot of the characters of Star Wars, particularly in the prequels. I absolutely love Anakin Skywalker. Like, don't get me started on Anakin Skywalker. I could just go forever about him. But the movies themselves, because they're science fiction, not 100% my type of movie. Okay. So I can definitely appreciate everything about the films, especially the films from the 70s with all of the special effects they brought in and all of that. But for me, Star Wars, I like the stories, I like the characters, don't love the movies. I know it sounds a bit weird, but that's kind of where I am with Star Wars,
Oh, yeah, and don't get me wrong, like, I'm a much bigger Star Trek fan than I am Star Wars, and definitely as we've gone on, I've been more up and down on some of the movies and just some of the stuff, but, like, the original 3 movies, I think, hold up well. Especially the first 2, and obviously the Empire Strikes Back is like I said with Back to the Future 2, it is the more darker film in the middle, and it's like, it's got that wonderfully iconic twist at the end, and With Nail and I.
Oh yeah, that's got Richard E. Grant. And I've actually seen parts of that. He plays a great character in that. Like his character in that is hilarious, like absolutely hilarious. Especially when he lets the landlord think that they're gay, and like his friend gets like really insulted. He's like, "How dare you tell him that I love you?" And he's just like, "What? Yeah, no, I know With Nell and I." Yeah,
it's a very good movie. Like they have a wonderful chemistry, those characters, and lots of great humor. But it's interesting you say like they pretend that they're gay, but like you could read it as they are really gay. That's something that is implied throughout the film. And
definitely. Because
it's a film where it's set in the 80s and just the timing of it, I think you could read it as they are secretly gay, but they're not, to define that era and some of the politics of the era. Some great use of music. So really, for a great comedy drama, With Nail and I is a big favourite. The Fly, Cronenberg, again, a fantastic remake. Dawn of the Dead, which technically, if you go with the Argento version, that's the 80s. I think if you go with the others, it's late 70s. There's more than one. Cinema Paradiso, that was very close. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
No.
Okay, that's one to check out. It's a beautiful, nostalgic love letter to cinema and coming of age film. The reason I didn't go with it is I've only seen it once, so it didn't quite. I wanted to see it a second time. So, comedy, the Scorsese movie with De Niro, which is very underrated. It's sort of more like like a pitch black satire type thing, because De Niro plays like a budding comedian, and he becomes so obsessed with getting his big break, and he becomes so obsessed with his favourite comedian, who's played in the movie by Jerry Lee Lewis, then he actually kidnaps him. So it's like a proper full-on like satire, and De Niro playing a more comedic style role.
That would be interesting.
It's a very underrated movie. Airplane, that was very close to me.
Oh, the Leslie Nielsen one?
Absolutely love it. One of those great, there's gags in every scene, and there's just so many missing Easter eggs and things to look out for. And one of my favourite jokes ever is, everyone knows it, surely you cannot be serious. I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
yes. I actually saw a GIF of that just the other day. It floated across my Tumblr dash.
Leslie Nielsen was wonderful. What a delight he was. Just so deadpan and always so game and committed. I loved the Naked Gun movies as well. The first couple, at least. Studio Ghibli filmed some of their best stuff later in the 80s, so like My Neighbor Totoro, for example.
Yes, I thought that one was from the 80s. Yeah. We're at number one. So mine's probably going to be a little bit of a surprise. It was a TV movie, and it was released as a TV movie, a two-part TV movie. It is these days more referred to as a miniseries, but because at the time it was released as a TV movie, I'm going to put it on this list because it is one of my favorite movies of all time. I grew up watching this, and that is the 1985 adaptation of Anne of Green Gables. Just one of my favorite movies ever. So when I was a kid, my papa, my grandfather on my mum's side used to tape movies for me off TV, and he'd cut out all the ads so that I could watch it like a proper film. And Anne of Green Gables was one of the earliest ones that he taped for me. For anyone who doesn't know the story, Anne Shirley is this red-haired orphan, and yes, you need to mention the red hair because that is a big part of her personality, who is taken in by the Cuthberts, this brother and sister who were originally going to adopt a boy, but through a misfortune, a little bit of miscommunication, ended up with Anne. And it's basically her story of coming to the Cuthberts, and again, a bit of a coming of age story. Anne is a complete disaster. Her character is absolutely ridiculous. Again, another character that I very much related to. She talks nonstop. She's got a massive imagination. She's always going on about everything under the sun. And my mother used to say that I was exactly like her, just chatting all the time, running around with my crazy imagination. But she's also a really great character because she's got a lot of ambition. She knows what she wants to do. She could definitely be seen as more of a feminist character for like period pieces, because this is set in the late 1800s. You know, she wants to get educated. She wants to go to college. She wants to become a teacher. She wants to go on grand adventures. But the thing with the original movie is it is just a really pretty, really sweet coming of age film centered around a character that I just really, really love. She has this really hilarious kind of rivalry with this guy in her class who calls her Carrots, which you do not call Anne Shirley Carrots. Do not mention her red hair, because this poor guy, who is pretty much completely in love with her, then has to deal with her freezing him out for like 3.5 years just because of this one like slight. And they're all kind of enemies to friends to lovers. Storyline is beautiful. Anne and Gil, they were one of my earliest ships before I even knew what, you know, shipping was. They were a couple that I absolutely loved. The supporting cast is really fun. It's a Canadian production, so all Canadian actors and actresses, some of who I have seen in some other stuff, some of who I've never really seen again. Megan Follows, who plays Anne, has gone on to have a somewhat decent career. She was recently in that series Reign, which was about I think Catherine Queen of Scots, and she was a character in there. But she is fantastic as Anne Shirley. She's just this really vivacious, bubbly, beautiful character who half the time you're like, girl, what are you even doing? Like, she's always getting herself into scrapes. She dyes her hair green at one point. She almost drowns in a boat in another point because she's like play acting some big like theatric show that she's putting on with her friends. And it's just really fun to watch her evolve and change, because the movie takes place over 3 years. So you really get to see her grow up. And they did make 2 sequels, one of which was still based on the book series, because it is based on the book series. The third one, though, completely threw all the canon out the window and just changed the setting and changed the characters, and it was really startling. But that original movie, so it holds a special place because it does remind me of my grandfather and how he used to tape those off TV for me, and, you know, we used to talk about them. So I've definitely got that link. But it's still a movie that I revisit over and over these days. It's one of my ultimate comfort movies. Beautiful score, beautiful scenery. It's set on Prince Edward Island in Canada, so it's absolutely gorgeous to look at. And it's just one of those feel-good movies that just has such a personal meaning for me and has been a part of my life for so long that it's just one of my absolute favorites. So probably something that it's a bit unexpected because it's not a very well-known movie, and it's not a movie that I do talk about often, especially because we don't really talk about, you know, period dramas and that sort of thing. It's not really the genre of movie that we talk about. But no, this movie has been with me for so many years and will always have that link to my papa for me. So that is my number one movie of the 80s, Anne of Green Gables, 1985.
Definitely know of it, and I know it has a good reputation, and I know there's been lots of different versions over the years.
There is. It's very popular in Japan, which is hilarious. There's like an anime version in Japan. And they did recently do a version on Netflix called Anne with an E, which is truly terrible. It basically, it takes this really sweet, light story and turns it into this really dark, gritty kind of story where there's like all of this horrible like violence and like just really bad stuff that was not in the books, that was not in the original series. And it's just, I only made it through 2 episodes, if that, because it was just so different to what I knew. So anyone who's watching this, don't watch Anne with an E. Find Anne of Green Gables, because it's much, much better. So yes.
Okay. I mean, that's the other side, because I'd heard pretty good things about that from other people, but then maybe they didn't have the same experience.
Yeah, and they may not have read the books. I think if you haven't read the books, obviously it'll be fine. But yeah, if you know the books and you know the original series like I do, you can't watch Anne with an E. It's terrible.
Very good, and I really like your reasoning as well. That's good stuff. One. Oh, damn. I mean, why I'm on my number one. The Elephant Man is an honourable mention as well.
Oh,
because, of course.
Oh, that movie. Yeah, I think I cried through almost that entire movie. It was heartbreaking.
But yeah, that's another big Lynch movie, which brings me on to my number one, which is a Lynch film, and it's She Wore Blue. Velvet
it.
So memorably sung by Isabel Rossellini in the movie as well. Wonderful performance of that song. And yeah, Blue Velvet from 1986, one of the defining David Lynch movies. Again,
an intense film.
Yeah, intense movie, a great cult movie like you just don't get anymore. Once again, returning to some of the classic Lynch themes where it is like unpacking the darker side to suburbia. It is showing how, in reality, like this picturesque, sort of airy-fairy, like American dream style values that you've got going on with certain characters. It's a little bit too naive. Like in reality, there's some really messed up, darker shit below the surface going on, and just the way Lynch vividly shows these two worlds and the contrast between them is what really makes the film so shocking and powerful. It's a very interesting movie when it comes to themes of gender and sexuality and kind of innocence and coming of age a little bit with like the Kyle MacLachlan and the Laura Dern characters.
Laura Dern, yeah.
Yeah, very young at the time, those two actors, and they have some really tough scenes to play in that movie and do really well. It's certainly probably the role which people know Isabel Rossellini the most for, and she is absolutely wonderful. It's such a powerful performance from her, so shocking, and she really has to play some really emotional, dark stuff. Also, like classic Lynch, it is drawing from different genres, so it definitely has a classic noir feel to it.
Yes.
Once again, he is like pastiche in classic like detective fiction and some great lines of dialogue. I really like the line, where the Laura Dern character Sandy isn't sure whether to trust Jeffrey or not. So she has that line that says, I'm not sure if you're like a pervert or like a detective or something, and he's like, that's for me to know and you to find out. And that's just a classic like noir style line ripped out of a noir style movie. And like I've talked before, because he was my number one film villain, but the Dennis
Frank Booth is
like he's animalistic and he is so unnerving. So that kind of villain where the scary thing about him is you can't predict him. Like he could be fine 1 minute and then just the smallest of things just sets him off, and he's the sort of villain that just likes to fuck with you and just play games and just the scene where they go riding and he like beats the Kyle MacLachlan character to a bloody pulp is so haunting, so full. But just the way the film uses music, but uses it in a very different context. So obviously the use of the Roy Orbison song in that, like In Dreams, and just to this really seedy, dark background, and like when they're singing it at the apartment before that and before they go on the joyride, and just this very off-kilter, strange Lynchian feel to that scene when they're singing with like the lampshade sort of things as the microphone and the lipstick. Once again, very interesting look at like sexuality in this movie. Because there's something almost where you could read it as like Frank being secretly gay, but because of the way he's been brought up and because he's such a masculine character, like it's almost like he's suppressing that. And because of some of the stuff with him and Rossellini where he secretly, he seemingly can't get sexually aroused or have and then you can definitely read that stuff as him maybe being gay and suppressing it. But very traumatizing movie, some of the sexual contests and the violence and the way it presents this link between extreme sexual experience and violence, and how at times there's a blurring of the lines. I almost read the film as like a dark fairy tale where it does
feel like that, doesn't it?
The use of music, the use of like the just the colours and the period details. And one of the things I like best about the movie is how it does exist in a very Lynchian style world, like the neighborhood, because there's like it has distinct certain like 40s 50s style, but then there's other elements where it feels like maybe like a more recent decade, so it just feels a bit out of time. Like it doesn't feel like one decade or the other. And
you can see that in some of his other films, like particularly Mulholland Drive has that feel again. You know, some of it feels like 50s classic Hollywood, but you can tell that it's set in this time. So, yeah, that's definitely a marker of Lynch's. He likes that.
Yeah, maybe a mix of things, but yeah. Very distinct film, very disturbing film, and also a link to my number 4, Paris, Texas, because Dean Stockwell's in this as well. Always a mark of quality, but you've got a nice mix of characters and casting, because Brad Dourif is in this in a small role. Yes,
he is, isn't he? Yeah.
Quite a young Brad Dourif at the time, but really good casting. And yeah, such a shocking, powerful, and stylistic movie. Like, it may well be Lynch's best movie. It's certainly up there, and very challenging. A lot to unpick in that. Yeah. And definitely the end of the movie, you could read it as actually being a bad ending as well, where things don't quite work out. Like, there's two readings you can have on the ending. Happy ending you see at first is more in the character's head, and in reality maybe it didn't quite pan out like that. Didn't pan
out as well. No. Elephant Man, I was like, oh duh, of course it's Blue Velvet. We've talked about this movie before. I have only seen this once. I watched it when I was doing a presentation on David Lynch, and I watched it as part of that repertoire, but it has never left me, this movie. Neither, like, Frank Booth might be one of the scariest villains ever. Just the violence that he inflicts on some of these characters is insane. And what I remember is that coming away from that movie feeling like, oh my God, like I just sat through like some of the most intense emotions that you can feel. It's definitely one that I want to go back and revisit, but I've stayed away from for a while because it's got some themes that I do find a bit triggering, like the domestic violence, some of the sexual assault. So like my favorite Lynch film is Mulholland Drive. I still think that is like, you know, up there. But I think if I rewatched Blue Velvet, that would be a strong contender. Because like I said, I've only watched it once, but it left such an impact on me. And it's just such a great Lynch film. So it's definitely one that I'll need to revisit. So that was cool. That was actually very interesting because I don't think we had a single crossover.
No, we didn't this time.
Which is rare for us. Usually we have at least one or two, and we had very different movies. And again, I think that's very reflective of our feelings towards the 80s. So you had like lots because you love that era, and obviously you were growing up in that decade. Whereas, like I said, mine are mostly a mix of my childhood favorites and then just some 80s films that really stood out for me. Because as we mentioned at the beginning, not a decade that I love, and we will definitely do an 80s versus 90s debate at some point. But that was actually fun. That was a fun list. We got some really good picks in there, and very different types of lists there. So that was very interesting.
Yeah, good stuff. Because another one I definitely could have had was the Goonies, because that's such a fun
gotta love the Goonies. One.
Absolutely. Yeah, I still rewatch that every now and again. Now.
As an honourable mention, I maybe even might bump one if I had forgotten about it. But sorry, I don't know what made me think of it. But Strictly Ballroom, I'm pretty sure is the 80s, based around Australian ballroom dancing, and again, it's got that kind of Baz Luhrmann surrealism where it's like some of it's like really hyper, like over the top, very funny in some places, some really fun Australian actors in this one, and the dance sequences are gorgeous, and you can see the markers for like especially Moulin Rouge. You can see it in this, so you watch this and you're like, oh yeah, you can see how he then went on to develop Romeo and Juliet and Moulin Rouge, and those three together are often marketed together as the Red Curtain trilogy because they all have very similar themes and markers in there. So yeah, Strictly Ballroom's another one. Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't. No, I've heard of
it out. It is fun. It is.
Thanks, guys, for listening. I hope you got some good ideas for 80s movies to check out if you haven't seen some of them, and also add your own picks in the comments, like what would your top 10 80s movies be, or just some of your favorites. Like and subscribe as always, share us out on social media, ding that bell to get notifications. Rachel, if you want to promote your channel.
Guys, you can follow me, Rachel McDonald, video essays on TV shows and movies. Nothing on the 80s yet, but you never know, maybe in the future. My Tumblr is also linked through my YouTube, and I spend way too much time on there. So Keith will usually put a link in the description, so please come and follow me everywhere.
Okay, good stuff, and we'll continue doing top 10 lists as we always do, and we will definitely do other decades for film as well, so look out for that, other TV lists as well. So take care, guys, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.